From the moment I opened my eyes to this world, faith was the foundation of my life. My name is Michael Carter, and I was raised in a devout Catholic family in the heart of Texas. My mother would wake up before dawn to pray, my father would read the Bible at night, and Sunday Mass was as essential to us as breathing. I grew up believing that faith alone would shield me from the darkness that lurks in the world. I never questioned what I could not see. I believed in angels, in the battle between good and evil, but these were abstract ideas, distant from my everyday life. That was until my 15th birthday, when I encountered something that shattered my understanding of reality. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. My breathing was steady, my body at ease, but my mind remained awake. Then, without warning, the world around me dissolved. I was no longer in my room. I found myself in a hospital. The air was cold, unnaturally still, carrying an eerie silence that pressed against my chest. The walls stretched endlessly, their sterile white surfaces devoid of life. I looked around, confusion gripping me until I noticed them, the patients, lined up along the corridors, their bodies frail, their faces marked by pain. But what struck me the most was their eyes. There was no hope in them, no faith, no prayers whispered into the void. Just silence, just fear. I tried to speak, to call out to them, but my voice would not come. My heart pounded against my ribs, an unbearable pressure growing within me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I awoke, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in gasps. I wanted to dismiss it as a nightmare, but I knew better. Something had changed. That night left a mark on me, an invisible thread pulling me toward a path I never expected to walk. I knew, deep within my soul, that my place was among those who teetered on the edge of life and death. That night, I made a decision. I would become a doctor. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The dream never left me. In the first week, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt that cold pressure in my chest again, the weight of something I could not explain. The image of those patients lingered in my mind, their empty eyes staring into nothingness. As the days passed, a strange feeling began to take root within me. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me towards something beyond my understanding. I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before. Small details in people's expressions, the sadness in the eyes of strangers, the way suffering seemed to hover in places most people ignored. I began to realize that hospitals were not just places of healing. They were places where people stood at the edge of two worlds, where life and death intertwined in ways that most could not see. And I couldn't shake the feeling that my vision had not been a dream but a glimpse into something real. Determined to find clarity, I confided in Father Thomas, the priest of our local parish. He had known me since I was a child, and if anyone could help me understand, it was him. When I finished recounting my experience, he remained silent for a long time, his fingers interlaced, his eyes searching for the right words. "Michael," he finally said, his voice calm yet firm, "what you saw was not just a dream. There are moments when God allows certain people to witness what lies beyond the veil of our reality. Sometimes, it is to prepare them for a greater purpose." A shiver ran through me. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he continued before I could speak. "The world we see is not the only world that exists. There are forces beyond our understanding, forces of light and darkness, always at war, especially in places where souls are most vulnerable. Hospitals are such places. You were shown something for a reason." His words only deepened the storm inside me. I wanted to believe I had imagined it all, that I was just a teenager with an overactive mind. But deep inside I knew the truth. That night, I prayed more intensely than I ever had before, asking God for guidance. I wanted to understand why I had seen what I had seen. But no answer came, at least not in the way I expected. Instead, I felt an overwhelming peace settle over me, as if unseen hands were reassuring me. The following years were filled with study and discipline. I threw myself into my education with a focus that surprised even my teachers. Becoming a doctor was no longer just a career choice, it was a calling, a mission. I wanted to be there, in those rooms, by the side of those who were suffering. Not just to heal their bodies, but to bring something more. Hope, faith, light in a place where darkness often lingered unseen. But I was not prepared for what awaited me. It was during my second year of medical school when it happened again. This time I wasn't dreaming. I was assisting in a hospital as part of my training, shadowing doctors as they worked through the night. The emergency room was a storm of movement. Patients being rushed in, machines beeping, doctors barking orders. It was overwhelming, but I was eager to learn, eager to help. Then I saw him. An elderly man had been brought in after suffering a cardiac arrest. His body lay motionless on the bed, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. The doctors worked with precision, pushing medications, attempting resuscitation, fighting to keep him in this world. And then I saw something no one else did. Shadows. Moving just beyond the reach of the hospital lights. Not the kind cast by people or objects, but something else entirely. They slithered along the walls, gathering near the man's bed, silent and patient. I felt my blood run cold. I blinked, thinking my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me, but they were still there, and they were watching him. Instinct took over. I whispered a prayer under my breath, barely audible over the chaos of the emergency room. As soon as I did, something changed. The shadows flinched like creatures exposed to a sudden burst of light. They recoiled, and for a moment the tension in the room shifted. The monitor let out a steady beep. "He's back," one of the doctors said, a mix of surprise and relief in his voice. I stared at the patient, my heart racing. The man's eyes fluttered open, dazed but alive. But as I looked at him, I saw something else. A flicker of awareness, as if he had seen what I had seen, as if he had been somewhere else before returning. I wanted to ask him what he had experienced, but before I could, the medical team moved in, stabilizing him. The moment passed, but the weight of what I had witnessed remained. That night, I knew without a doubt that my vision as a child had been real. And I knew that something far greater was at play. This was not just about medicine. This was a battle. And I was being called to fight it. The air in the hospital was different at night. The sterile walls, the soft hum of the monitors, the distant murmurs of nurses walking through the dimly lit corridors, it all seemed normal on the surface. But underneath there was something else. Something unseen. I had felt it before, in fleeting moments, in the stillness of a dying patient's breath, in the quiet sobs of a family member standing just outside a hospital room. I had tried to suppress my fear, convincing myself that what I had seen, the shadows, the presence lurking in the corners, was nothing more than my imagination. But deep inside I knew better. The moment in the emergency room, when the old man had been on the brink of death and the darkness had gathered around him, had confirmed what I had suspected for years. There was more to death than what medical science could explain. I was still a student when I experienced my second undeniable encounter with the unseen. This time it was in the intensive care unit. The night shift was always the most challenging. Patients in critical condition, their lives hanging by a thread, the weight of every decision pressing down on the staff. I had volunteered to stay late, eager to learn, eager to understand. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to witness. It was just past 2 in the morning when I was assigned to monitor a patient who had been in a coma for several weeks. He was a man in his 60s, his body frail, his face drawn as if he had been fighting a battle no one else could see. His vital signs were stable, but his condition was unchanged. At first, everything seemed routine. I checked his charts, noted his medications, and made sure his oxygen levels were steady. Then something caught my attention. His eyes, closed for weeks, began to move beneath his eyelids, shifting rapidly as if he were dreaming. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. His body remained motionless, yet something about his expression had changed. His face, once calm in unconsciousness, now looked strained, almost as if he were experiencing pain. But there was something else, a shadow of fear, a silent scream frozen in the lines of his aging skin. And then I saw it. Standing at the foot of his bed was a figure. It was not a doctor. It was not a nurse. It was something else. A silhouette darker than the dimly lit room, motionless, watching. I blinked, convinced my eyes were deceiving me, but it did not disappear. It was real. My body froze, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to call for someone, to do something. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear I had never known before. And then the patient gasped. A deep, rattling sound, like air struggling to fill his lungs. His body convulsed slightly, his hands twitching as if trying to grasp onto something unseen. The monitors beeped erratically, his heart rate spiking, his breath becoming shallow. The figure did not move. It only watched. I didn't know what else to do. But in that moment, I did the only thing that felt right. I prayed. Not with my voice, but with my soul. A desperate, silent plea for divine intervention. And then something changed. The air in the room shifted. A warmth spread through my chest, a lightness that countered the suffocating dread I had felt just moments before. The dark figure at the foot of the bed shuddered, as if struck by an unseen force. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The patient exhaled, his breathing stabilizing. The erratic beeping of the monitors slowed. And I knew without a doubt, that I had just witnessed something far beyond human understanding. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the man who had just come back from the brink. His face had relaxed, his expression no longer twisted in fear. I stepped out of the room, my hands trembling, my mind reeling from what had just happened. This was real. And I could no longer pretend otherwise. Hospitals were more than just places of healing. They were battlefields. And not every battle was fought with medicine. That night, I made a decision. I would not only fight for life with science, I would fight for souls with faith. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. There comes a moment when denial is no longer an option. I had spent years trying to rationalize what I had seen, convincing myself that exhaustion, stress, or even an overactive imagination had twisted my perception of reality. But by the time I entered my residency, I could no longer ignore the truth. The unseen was real. Hospitals were more than places of healing, they were battlegrounds. And the war was not just between life and death but between forces far beyond human understanding. I had witnessed it firsthand, the presence in the shadows, waiting, lingering. Sometimes they were at the foot of a dying patient's bed, watching as if they had come to collect something. Other times I could feel them standing behind me just beyond my field of vision, a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I had learned that prayer was my only weapon against them. But that knowledge was put to the ultimate test one night in the pediatric unit. It was just after 2 in the morning when the emergency call came. A little girl, no more than 2 years old, had been rushed in after nearly drowning in a pool. By the time paramedics arrived at the scene, she had no pulse. They had managed to revive her, but barely. Her heartbeat was weak, her body cold, her tiny chest barely rising and falling as she clung to the last threads of life. When I arrived at her bedside, I could feel it immediately. Something was wrong. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, suffocating. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as if reacting to an unseen force. The other doctors and nurses focused on stabilizing the girl, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that we were not alone. As I leaned in to check her pupils, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. Her face. Even in her unconscious state, her expression was one of sheer terror. Her tiny lips were slightly parted as if she had been trying to scream, but no sound had come out. Her hands were curled into small fists, clenched so tightly that her nails had left marks on her palms. I had seen fear before. I had seen it in the dying, in the desperate, in those who knew their time was running out. But this was different. This child wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting against something. Then the heart monitor let out a shrill alarm. Her heartbeat, already fragile, began to plummet. The nurses moved quickly, preparing for resuscitation, their movements efficient and practiced. But I couldn't look away from her face. Her expression of terror deepened. And then I saw it. A shadow. It stood just beyond the edge of the bed, a formless, shifting darkness, darker than anything I had ever seen. It didn't have a face, yet I felt it staring directly at me. A cold, unnatural fear gripped my chest. I had seen these things before, lurking in the periphery, watching the weak, the dying. But never like this. Never with such intention. I wanted the girl. I don't know how I knew, but I did. It was waiting for her to slip just a little further. I had never prayed so hard in my life. I didn't speak out loud. I didn't need to. The prayer came from somewhere deeper, a desperate cry from my soul. I called upon the name of Jesus, clinging to the only thing that had ever pushed these things away. The moment I did, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then the beeping of the monitor changed. The girl's heartbeat, which had been moments from flatlining, suddenly stabilized. The nurses paused, exchanging surprised glances. "She's responding," one of them whispered. But I barely heard them. My eyes were still locked on the corner of the room where the shadow had been. It was gone. The weight that had pressed against my chest lifted. The air in the room became lighter. It was as if something had been driven out. I exhaled, realizing only then that my hands were shaking. That night, I understood something that would change me forever. The battle for life wasn't just fought in hospital rooms with medicine and machines. It was fought in the unseen, in the space between worlds, in the moments where a soul teetered on the edge. And there were forces waiting, always waiting. I had seen it, and I knew I would see it again. The more time I spent in the hospital, the more I understood that some battles could not be fought with medicine alone. I had seen things that defied explanation, felt a presence that no one else seemed to notice. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But the more it happened, the more undeniable it became. It was no longer a question of belief. It was a question of survival. There were moments, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when I could sense them. The unseen. They lingered in the corners of dimly lit rooms, near patients who were slipping away, just beyond the reach of the monitors and machines. Sometimes, it was just a feeling, an unnatural weight pressing down on my chest. Other times it was more. A flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision. A shadow where there should have been none. I prayed more often now. It was no longer a ritual of habit, no longer something I did just on Sundays. It became my armor, the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. And then came the night that I realized just how real this battle was. It was just after midnight when I was called to the intensive care unit. A man in his late 40s had suffered a stroke. His condition was worsening by the minute, his body shutting down, his breathing shallow. His wife sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering prayers through her tears. Something about the room felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed dimmer than usual. The heart monitor beeped in irregular intervals, a sound I had heard 1,000 times before but that, on this night, sent a chill down my spine. I stepped closer to examine him. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted as if caught between two worlds. His wife looked up at me, eyes red, desperate. "He keeps whispering," she said softly, her voice trembling. I frowned. "Whispering?" She nodded, gripping his hand tighter. "I can't understand what he's saying. It's not English. It's not any language I know." A cold shiver ran through me. I turned my attention back to the patient. His eyes were still closed, his face unmoving. But as I leaned in, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, like wind slipping through a crack in a window. But it was coming from his lips. The words were foreign, strange. They carried no familiarity, no logical structure. It was as if he was speaking in a language that was not his own. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I had seen patients in delirium before, confused, murmuring nonsense in their sleep. But this was different. This was deliberate. The words came in slow, measured tones as if he was responding to someone. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it. A presence. Cold watching. Standing just beyond the dim light of the room, lingering in the shadows. The whispering from the patient grew louder. His breath hitched, his body tensed, and suddenly his eyes flew open. Black. Not the natural darkness of pupils, but an unnatural void, deep and endless. His wife screamed. The machines beeped wildly as his heart rate spiked, his body convulsing. The whispering turned to a rasping, guttural sound, something inhuman. I felt frozen in place, unable to move. But then instinct took over. I grabbed the small cross pendant that I had begun wearing under my coat, clutching it tightly. And I prayed. Not just in my mind but out loud. With urgency, with desperation. "In the name of Jesus Christ, let him go." The moment the words left my lips, the air in the room shifted. The suffocating heaviness lifted, the shadow in the corner seemed to ripple, and the man gasped, his body jerking violently before slumping back onto the bed. His eyes, black just moments ago, were normal again. His breathing steadied. The machines calmed. The presence was gone. I stood there, shaken, my hands trembling. The man blinked slowly, his expression dazed. He turned his head slightly, his gaze unfocused but clear. "Where am I?" he whispered. His wife sobbed, throwing herself onto him, clutching his hand as if afraid to let go. I could barely speak. My mind was racing, my heart still hammering in my chest. It had been real. All of it. I had not imagined the whispers, the presence, the darkness that had momentarily claimed him. That night as I left the hospital, I looked up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind clouds, the moon barely visible. But I knew beyond all doubt that there was more at play in this world than most people ever realized. There were battles happening all around us. And I was no longer just a witness. I was in the fight. The night shifts never got easier. No matter how many patients I saw, how many cases I handled, there was always an uneasiness that settled in my chest when the halls grew quiet. I had learned to trust my instincts, to recognize when something unseen was at work. It was past midnight when I was called to check on a patient in the cardiac unit. The man had been stable all evening, but suddenly, his condition took a turn. As I walked into the room, I immediately felt it. Something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy. The monitors beeped steadily, but the man's breathing was uneven. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I called his name. No response. Then slowly his lips parted. "They are here." My body tensed. "Who is here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His breathing grew ragged. His hands clutched at the sheets as if fighting off something unseen. "They've come for me." The monitors began to beep erratically. His heart rate was spiking. Nurses rushed in, pushing me aside to begin emergency intervention. I stepped back, gripping the cross around my neck. I knew. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. Waiting. Watching. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer. The beeping slowed. The tension in the air dissipated. When I opened my eyes, the man's breathing had steadied. His gaze met mine, and for the first time that night there was clarity. "They don't like when you do that," he said weakly. Neither did I. But I wasn't going to stop. Days passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I knew the war I had stepped into wasn't ending anytime soon. It was a late evening when I found myself alone in the hospital chapel. The weight of everything I had seen, everything I had felt, pressed down on me. I knelt, resting my forehead against my folded hands. "God, I don't know why you chose me to see this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Silence. Then a thought settled in my mind, clear, undeniable. Keep fighting. Keep praying. Keep standing in the gap. Asterisk, asterisk. The battle was not over. And neither was my purpose. If you've made it this far, you're part of this journey. Like this video, subscribe, and comment your name and city so we can send you a special greeting in the next one. You are not alone. We are in this together.